May 27, 1937. One royal document strips 4 words from Wallis Simpson's future. The letter's patent gave the former King Edward V a new identity, His Royal Highness, the Duke of Windsor. Then the line stopped. Wallis Simpson would become Duchess of Windsor, but not Her Royal Highness. Her Royal Highness. Gone. In a monarchy built on rank, precedence, invitations, curtsies, and who enters a room first, that was a boundary. Officially, the decree came through King George VI. But paper rarely moves alone. Around him stood a palace circle, determined to contain the damage of abdication. Inside that circle was Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, the new queen consort, later remembered as Britain's smiling queen mother. She did not secretly run the state. The sharper question is how private resentment, constitutional fear, and family injury became policy that looked clean, legal, and polite. Wallis's missing HRH was only the first instrument. After title came money. After money came distance. After distance came access. Who was received, who was ignored, and who was kept outside the gate? Was this revenge against Wallis Simpson, or a survival mechanism for the crown? So the first clue is not a confession. It is a missing title, not a secret coup, and not just a family feud wrapped in court etiquette. Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon did not make Edward VI fall in love with Wallis Simpson. She did not force him to abdicate. Edward made that choice, in collision with the church, the government, the dominions, and the expectations of the crown itself. But after December 1936, a quieter power came into view. Not the power to pass an act of parliament alone or command ministers like servants. The power of influence. What a new king heard at home. What palace advisors considered necessary. What cabinet papers treated as prudent. And what family resentment could become when written in official language. So the test is not whether Elizabeth personally signed every punishment. She did not. The test is whether her influence keeps appearing beside the same 4 pressure points. First, title. What Wallis could be called. Then money. How dependent the Duke would remain. Then movement. How far from Britain the couple would be kept. Finally, access. Who would receive them, invite them, or quietly close the door. Some of this is confirmed on paper, some survives in letters, diaries, biographies, and courtier memories, and some sits in the gray space between evidence and interpretation. That boundary matters, because monarchy often works most effectively where no one person has to leave fingerprints. To understand why those levers mattered, we have to go back before the 1937 decree, to the rupture that put Elizabeth's husband on the throne. The crack opened almost as soon as Edward V became king. In January 1936, the crown passed to a man with charm, popularity, and little patience for the limits of the throne. By the end of that year, the question around him was constitutional. Edward wanted to marry Wallis Simpson, an American woman who had already divorced once and was ending a second marriage. For a private man, that would have been scandalous enough in 1930s Britain. For the king, it struck several systems at once. He was Supreme Governor of the Church of England, whose teaching still treated remarriage after divorce as a grave moral obstacle while a former spouse was living. He was also a constitutional monarch, dependent on ministers answerable to Parliament, and sovereign of dominions whose governments could not simply be ordered to accept the marriage. The crisis moved from private drawing rooms to cabinet meetings, bishops, and dominion governments. The romance version makes it sound like one man choosing love over a crown. Inside the palace, the image was harsher, a king placing personal desire above the machinery that made kingship possible. Edward abdicated in December 1936. The crown moved to his younger brother, Albert, known as Bertie, who took the name George VI. He had not been trained by temperament for the role Edward abandoned. He struggled with a speech impediment, dreaded public performance, and now had to become the steady face of a monarchy shaken in public. Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon's life changed with his. She had married a second son, not a future king. Their daughters, Princess Elizabeth and Princess Margaret, were children suddenly pushed toward the center of the state. The older girl, not yet 11, was now heir presumptive. This is where Elizabeth's later severity begins to make sense. even if it does not excuse every consequence. To her, the abdication was a wound. It forced her husband into a burden he had not sought, exposed her children to dynastic pressure, and made the monarchy look breakable when it needed to look permanent. Once Edward was no longer king, the first battlefield was rank, whether Wallis Simpson would stand beside him as Her Royal Highness. Now the missing letters matter. HRH. Outside the palace, they can sound decorative. Inside the royal system, they decide who is treated as family, who is received as an equal, and who remains just outside the circle. After the abdication, Edward was no longer king, but he was not erased. George VI made him Duke of Windsor, and Edward retained the style His Royal Highness. On paper, that preserved his birth rank as a prince of the blood. Wallis was treated differently. The letters patent of May 1937 drew the line with legal precision. Edward could be His Royal Highness, the Duke of Windsor. Wallis, after their marriage, would be Duchess of Windsor, but not Her Royal Highness. No angry language was needed. The sanction was built into the wording. This was not a small matter of snobbery. At court, forms of address shaped precedents, seating, invitations, and perceived legitimacy. An HRH could stand within the royal hierarchy. Without it, Wallis could be married to a royal duke and still be marked as unequal to him. Here the evidence splits. The decree itself is confirmed. It was issued under George VI authority. The behind-the-scenes pressure is more indirect, but persistent. Biographers, correspondence, and courtier accounts place Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon among the strongest voices against allowing Wallis full royal equality. That distinction matters. Elizabeth was not acting as a lone ruler above the state, but the reported pattern fits the world she had entered. A new queen consort, protecting a wounded husband, determined that the woman associated with the abdication would not be publicly elevated into the family she believed had been damaged. The first lever was status. It made exclusion visible at every doorway, introduction, and formal table. But title alone could humiliate. To keep the Windsors dependent, the palace also had to shape money. Status humiliated, money controlled. After the abdication, Edward was no longer the sovereign, but he was not an ordinary private man. He had been king. He had lived as king. Every question about his future carried another question underneath it. Who would pay for the life of a former monarch who had walked away? The financial settlement was not just a private family arrangement. Cabinet discussions in 1937 treated the Duke's allowance as a matter of state importance, because his income affected more than comfort. It shaped his freedom of movement, his ability to maintain staff, his capacity to entertain, and the degree to which he could present himself abroad as a royal figure with independent weight. This is where an allowance becomes leverage. The confirmed layer is official. George VI and the government held formal authority. The Duke's position had to be managed through constitutional channels, public funds, private royal resources, and political judgment. This was not Elizabeth signing checks in a back room, and it was not simple theft or confiscation. But the reported palace layer points in the same direction as the title decision. Courtier accounts and biographical evidence describe a palace circle wary of giving Edward too much independence, dignity, or room to become a problem. Elizabeth belonged to that circle as the new queen consort closest to a king who felt betrayed by his brother and burdened by the crown Edward had abandoned. So the allowance was never just an allowance. It worked like a valve. Open it too far, and the Windsors could build a more autonomous life, with staff, travel, influence, and social confidence. Tighten it, and the Duke remained dependent on the institution he had wounded. For Edward, that dependency cut sharply. He had given up the throne for Wallis, but still expected the deference and security of a man born at the center of the empire. Instead, his post-abdication life was negotiated through files, conditions, and conversations from which he was largely absent. The second lever did not erase him. It narrowed his room to maneuver. Once status and money were constrained, the next question was where a former king could safely exist without becoming a rival court. The paper trail now becomes a map. Money kept the Duke dependent. Distance kept him contained. After the abdication, Edward and Wallis built most of their life away from Britain, with France becoming their main stage. Villas, society dinners, careful appearances, close enough to watch London, but far enough not to compete with it directly. There was no single public document saying the former king was banished forever. The mechanism was quieter. Requests for roles, returns, and recognition could be slowed, narrowed, or made conditional until the message became clear. For the palace, the fear was not that Edward would march back and seize a throne he had surrendered. The fear was softer, affection. A former king in Britain, charming guests, receiving old friends, moving through drawing rooms with Wallis beside him, could become an alternative emotional center of royal life, not a legal rival court, but a social one, a shadow version of court life. That possibility mattered because monarchy depends on focus. One sovereign, one household, one line of loyalty. George VI's reign was still young and fragile, and every reminder of Edward's glamour risked making the new king look like the substitute rather than the settled answer. So distance worked alongside title and allowance. France was not just a place on the map. It became the safest distance between the crown and the man who had once worn it. Social exile did the rest. Invitations could fail to arrive. Precedence could be withheld. Official duties could be denied. The Windsors could have houses, clothes, guests, and headlines, but not the one thing they wanted most from the family they had left behind: full recognition. Here the story becomes more complicated, because the woman associated with guarding that boundary was not remembered by the public as cold at all. Here is the turn. The familiar public image of Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon can mislead if it is treated as the whole person. She was remembered smiling through bomb damage, visiting shattered streets, wearing hats and pearls as if public duty itself had a uniform. And the warmth was real. During the war, and for decades afterward, she gave many people an image of steadiness when Britain needed one. But the same instinct that made her effective in public could become unyielding in private. Protect the crown, protect the family line, protect the story the monarchy needed the country to believe. Courtier diaries and later biographies describe her hostility toward the Duke and Duchess of Windsor as lasting. The tone reported around her was not simply irritation over manners, it was the memory of a rupture. Edward had walked away from the throne, and in Elizabeth's view, pushed her shy, stammering husband into a burden he had never been trained to want, while placing their young daughters directly in the line of dynastic consequence. We do not need to turn that belief into a medical claim about George VI to understand its force. For Elizabeth, the abdication was duty abandoned by one brother and inherited by another. There was also class and convention inside this response. Wallis was divorced, American, socially disruptive, and hard to fit into the older royal grammar of rank, deference, and acceptable womanhood. To Elizabeth, recognizing Wallis fully would have looked like rewarding the breach that had shaken the throne. So the warm public figure and the hard private operator were not two separate women. They were two expressions of the same protective worldview. Charm held the nation close. Protocol kept the perceived danger out. Because her pressure moved through family feeling, court culture, and tradition, it rarely had to look like revenge. Tradition can be a weapon, especially when everyone involved can call it duty. If this was more than a personality conflict, then the Windsor exile becomes larger than one unforgiving queen. It becomes a pattern the monarchy could use again, not always in the same way, and not always with the same evidence, but with the same cold logic underneath. The Windsor story reaches beyond one marriage, and beyond one woman's resentment. It shows how an institution can punish without raising its voice. When a royal choice threatened the institution, the response did not have to sound cruel. It could sound administrative. A title could be withheld. An allowance could be debated, delayed, or made conditional. A return to Britain could be treated as a political problem rather than a family visit. Invitations, greetings, seating plans, and official recognition could quietly decide who belonged and who merely existed near the edge of the family. There they are again: title, money, movement, and access. None looked dramatic. All could be explained as prudence. Together, they made exile feel less like punishment and more like order. That does not mean every later royal rupture follows the same script. Different people, different evidence, different pressures. But the Windsor settlement left a precedent inside the palace imagination. If personal desire begins to compete with the crown, the institution can survive by narrowing the person's place within it. Every side paid for that survival. Edward and Wallis gained the life they said they wanted, but lost full legitimacy in the world they still craved. George VI gained the throne, but only because his brother walked away from it. Elizabeth gained influence by guarding the boundary so fiercely that the boundary became part of her legacy. The monarchy endured. The crowds still gathered. The balcony still filled. The papers still carried the language of duty and continuity. But behind that continuity was a colder bargain. The family could remain sacred only if the institution came first. And when the institution came first, affection became negotiable. Now the broad pattern returns to the file where it began. The strongest evidence is not a whispered motive. It is the paper trail. What was signed, what was withheld, and what remained just out of sight. So we return to the file where the boundary first became visible. The confirmed record is clear. In May 1937, Wallis Simpson was denied the style of Her Royal Highness, while the Duke of Windsor kept his. The financial settlement, the distance from Britain, and the control of access all followed through official channels. King, cabinet, palace, and court machinery moving together. What the record cannot give us is a single signed statement from Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon saying, "This was mine." That is not how this kind of power usually appears. Her influence lived in pressure, proximity, memory, and the power to object. It lived in the trust George VI placed in her judgment, in the hostility recorded by courtiers, and in the consistency of the line held against the Windsors for decades. So the fairest verdict is not that she secretly ruled the crown, it is that she became one of its most decisive informal guardians. Not a monster, not a puppet master outside the Constitution. A woman who believed the monarchy had almost been broken, and who helped make sure the people she blamed never came fully back inside. That is the tragedy of the Windsor exile. Its weapon was not a prison cell or a public sentence. It was a title withheld, a door unopened, an allowance controlled, an invitation that never arrived. The paper looked polite. The effect lasted a lifetime, because protocol can punish and still call itself duty.